First, thank you very much for this invitation. It's really an honor for me to be here and a pleasure, and so nice to have such a large audience of people interested in this subject. I'd like to thank in particular Professor Liz Bird, who extended the invitation, my old friend Roger Arieff, and Liz Kisak for all the work she's done to make this event possible. So let me begin with the year 1973. In 1973, conferences celebrating the 500th anniversary of the birth of Nicholas Copernicus were held all over the world. These sorts of anniversary celebrations associated with Copernicus's birth in 1473 and his death in 1543 had been taking place ever since historians first began to assemble a serviceable archive of documents about Copernicus in the 1870s and 1880s. Some of these celebratory events were driven by political and cultural concerns that projected onto the historical figure of Copernicus sensitive issues of national identity. For example, did Copernicus consider himself a German or a Pole? Even the spelling of his name became a contested issue. Sometimes he served as a symbol of hope in a time of desperation. In 1943, with Poland under the dark shadow of Nazi occupation, Albert Einstein spoke at a special Copernicus event organized by the Kosciuszko Foundation in New York City. 30 years later, in the middle of the Cold War, Polish historians of science anticipated that 1973 would be a prime occasion to improve contacts with the West. An international organizing committee put high priority on bringing scholars to Poland from Western countries. One of the organizers was Owen Gingerich, an astronomer at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, who had developed a deep interest and considerable expertise in the history of astronomy, and who became well known for his prolific and fundamental contributions, one of which was his 30-year hunt for surviving copies of Copernicus's book. Well, in a book where Gingerich describes some of his adventures in tracking down these copies, he opens a chapter with a personal anecdote from the 1973 Polish Copernicus quinquacentennial, and I quote from that book. Two distinguished scholars had been assigned a private limousine to get them from Warsaw to Copernicus's birthplace, Torun. Edward Rosen, the Dean of Copernican Studies, and Willy Hartner, Europe's leading historian of the exact sciences, emerged from the car, no longer on speaking terms. During the journey, Hartner had had the audacity to suggest that Copernicus and his first disciple, Georg Joachim Rheticus, could have discussed astrology. I vaguely remember when Rosen and Hartner stepped out of their limo, but unlike Gingerich, I did not fully appreciate the depth of the altercation, nor could I have possibly anticipated that 40 years later, that disagreement would provide more than a convenient anecdote for my talk this evening. Commenting on the disagreement, Gingerich observed that, and I quote here, Copernicus lived in an era when astrological ideas permeated academia at all the institutions where he studied, Krakow, Bologna, Padua, and Ferrara. Similarly, Rheticus, the young mathematical practitioner who had come to visit the aging Copernicus in 1539 and lived with him for over 2 years, was deeply conversant with astrological practice. In 1535, Rheticus had composed a general oration on astrology at the University of Wittenberg. In the early 1540s, he published several astrological prognostications. But most famously, he and Copernicus developed a sufficiently trusting relationship such that the older man allowed the younger to write and publish a brief description of his theory. Many people don't know that Rheticus, in fact, was the first one to describe in print the heliocentric theory of Copernicus. Well, Gingrich thus concluded on the side of Hartner that, I quote, Rheticus and Copernicus must certainly have discussed the subject of astrology. Now, it should be acknowledged that Rosen was well aware that astrology was widely practiced during Copernicus's lifetime. But against Hartner, he argued that Copernicus was exceptional in not pursuing the subject. And Rosen's views, first expressed in 1939, remained fixed until his final publication on the subject. Did Copernicus believe in astrology, he asked? This is an aspect of Copernicus's mentality. He lived in an age when many of those in power, as well as of those on the lower rungs of the social ladder, believed in astrology. Copernicus did not. Unquestionably influenced by Rosen, Thomas Kuhn put forth much the same view about Copernicus's indifference to astrology in his classic and influential 1957 study, The Copernican Revolution. Here's what Kuhn said. It may even be significant that Copernicus, the author of the theory that ultimately deprived the heavens of special power, belonged to the minority group of Renaissance astronomers who did not cast horoscopes. But a solution to the question of Copernicus's possible involvement with astrology then stalled, because no one found any reports of conversations between Copernicus and Rheticus, and nothing written by Copernicus on that subject. The episode thus lends itself both to historiographical disagreement and to speculation. In fact, the acclaimed historical playwright Dava Sobel has written a play recently in which she imagines what such a conversation between Rheticus and Copernicus could have been like. The play, by the way, has been produced several times in different countries. In my recent book, The Copernican Question, I've attempted to open up the problem again, arguing that we've not paid adequate attention to circumstantial evidence and to contextual considerations. Today, I intend to push my argument further. To begin, let's consider for a moment the Black Death. And here you can see in this diagram the vectors of the disease. I regard this development as an important long-term background explanation for the rise of widespread interest in astrology. What you should focus attention here is on some of these arrows that you can see the dates here, how quickly the disease spread from the Mediterranean region up into the Scandinavian countries, also into Spain, then around to England, to Scotland, all of this very, very quickly. According to a recent study, more recent incidentally than the slide you see, between 1346 and 1353, so we're right in the middle of the 14th century, this European-wide catastrophe killed approximately 50 million people. That's 60% of the total population of Europe, a staggering and horrifying figure. Further outbreaks continued to occur until around the time of Newton in the early 18th century. It's very common to find evidence in the lives of major figures of the scientific revolution about the plague. Simply put, episodes of the plague were a constant presence in the lives of ordinary people throughout Europe, including all the figures who contributed to the scientific revolution. Well, the current dominant theory is that the disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread by rat fleas, quickly and easily transported by ships along commercial routes. For ordinary people confronted with the spectacle of mass death, the obvious explanation lay in God's displeasure with human sinfulness. For the doctors, the best explanatory resource lay in the baleful conjunction of evil planetary influences. Bear in mind that this initial demographic disaster, with its massive political, economic, and cultural consequences, occurred just over a century before Copernicus's birth in 1473. But it was not the last such disease outbreak to invade Europe. During Copernicus's own lifetime, the French King Charles VIII led a massive army of 30,000 soldiers into Italy. Basically, the route that the French took was along the coast here, through Genoa, and then down into the peninsula. They moved very quickly. The army consisted of 30,000 soldiers. It was the largest such army that had been seen in Europe since the ancient world. In 1494, the French were in Florence. They drove out the ruling Medici family. By January 1495, they had reached Rome, and a month later, they were down here in the Kingdom of Naples. Naples at the time was dominated by the Spaniards, so you had Spanish kings ruling Naples. Charles not only upset the balance of power in the delicate alliances that constituted the Italian state system, but his troops encountered a new epidemic. It came to be known in the invaded regions as the French disease. And it was called that at least as early as 1498 by an astrological physician. Here's a woodcut made in 1496, so that's 2 years after the invasion began, which displays a man infected with the French disease. The woodcut was made at Nuremberg by the famous artist Albrecht Dürer, and it accompanies a poem about the disease. You'll notice that above the figure here is a celestial sphere. This is the zodiac, divided into 12 signs. And below the sign of Scorpio, which governs the genitals, we find the date 1484. You can see that right here. In that year, there was an astrologically significant conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, whose evil effects, it was believed, were still being felt in 1496. Something like earthquake aftershocks. In 1530, an astrological physician named Girolamo Fracastoro coined the word syphilis. We will come back to him later on in the talk. Well, let me underline here two larger themes about astrology in this period. First, it's no accident that physicians of the 1490s and beyond who consulted the planets to diagnose their patients' illnesses were preoccupied with war and disease. Those are the two major themes that one finds in the prognostications. More generally, astrological prognosticators were concerned to predict the political fate of both individual rulers and social groups living in a particular region, using what they knew from astronomy about the planets' positions in relation to the Earth, the planets' mutual alignments, conjunctions such as the one I mentioned of Saturn and Jupiter, or eclipses. Eclipses were believed to have particularly harmful effects. The second theme, larger theme, concerns the introduction of print technology around 1451 by a German blacksmith and goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg. You've probably heard of him. It's no accident that within 20 years after Gutenberg published his first book, which happened to be the Bible, that German printers began to set up shops in major cities and also university towns, and soon after, astrological prognosticators began to use the new medium of print to produce their forecasts. Printing made it possible to generate and distribute forecasts much more quickly and efficiently than handwritten forecasts. Astronomy predicted planetary positions in the belt of the zodiac. Astrology described the meanings and physical effects of the planet's influences. Contemporaries regarded these two disciplines, astronomy and astrology, as constituting what they typically called the science of the stars. The science of the stars. Astronomy and astrology. Now, of course, this combination of disciplines and applications is a far cry from the modern tendency to associate astrology with newspaper horoscopes, or even with the wife of a recent president, who regularly consulted an astrologer, Nancy Reagan, or with the quip of a famous economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, "The only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable," said Galbraith. But these sorts of anecdotes, which we can find in, here and there, about astrology's persistence in contemporary popular culture merely call attention to the fact that astrology has lost the political value and social prestige that it once enjoyed among European elites in the 15th and 16th centuries. Well, now, pulling our historical camera back still further, we can point to a century of major events in which printing was significantly involved. So if we start in 1451 with Gutenberg's Bible, 2 years later, the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, was renamed Istanbul. You may have noticed it's still an important city in our own times. Followed by prophecies of the spread of Islam into Christian Europe. Great fears were generated by this. Then books about the voyages and discoveries of Christopher Columbus in the 1490s. Then the French invasion of Italy, which I just talked about, 1494, 1498. And Luther's revolt against the Church of Rome in 1517. And Luther's translation of the Bible into German. The beginning of propaganda, used by both Catholics and Protestants to negatively caricature one another. All of these phenomena I've just mentioned were associated with printing. Here you have an example of the kind of power that print could generate. Here we have a representation of the Pope on his throne. He's issued a proclamation. It's called a bull. And the artist has shown fire coming out of the bull. Here, fire and brimstone. And here are two peasants who are issuing a reply to the Pope here. This is the beginning of propaganda and cartooning. So it's no accident that print technology made possible an expanded literature of the heavens, right along with these other developments. Regular annual astrological prognostications for cities, not individuals, but for entire cities, for regions, as well as publication of all sorts of auxiliary works that helped you produce the prognostications, medieval Arabic astrology, and ancient Greek astronomy. All these texts were now being produced in the 1490s and beyond, put into print and used in the service of producing these astrological forecasts. Well, in my remaining time, I want to look more carefully at the question of who exactly was supporting this burgeoning enterprise of astral prognostication just before and during the time of Copernicus. If printed annual prognostications were short, relatively cheap to produce, and easy to understand, who was interested in supporting the publication of long, difficult, technical works of theoretical astronomy, like those of Copernicus or his highly esteemed predecessor, Johannes Regiomontanus? Or for that matter, what about the data, the tables of planetary positions, the columns of numbers, basically, that astrologers used to produce their forecasts? Who was going to produce those? Who was going to print? Imagine how difficult that was in the early days of printing, to produce columns of numbers that were precise. For several decades after Gutenberg, astronomers and astrologers usually copied tables of numbers by hand. But the question in which I want to focus here concerns the social relationships and motivations that supported the practices that connected the two parts of the science of the stars. On the one hand, the technical calculatory models and tables of numbers necessary for forecasting planetary positions, and the other part concerned with interpreting the meanings and the effects of the influences of the planets. So I begin now with the planetary tables of an Italian named Giovanni Bianchini. The historians Jose Chabas and Bernard Goldstein have written that the tables of Bianchini were, I quote, the largest set of astronomical tables produced in the West before modern times. Bianchini was the financial administrator at one of the important North Italian princely courts of the mid-15th century, the courts of the Dukes of Ferrara, and he was also professor of mathematics at the University of Ferrara. This is a very typical kind of position one finds, a kind of bridge position between a court and university. This is the first page of a manuscript produced by Bianchini. So this is, if you want to know what a manuscript looks like, this is handwritten, but there's an artist who's done some work here. I'll be talking about that shortly. Okay, well, 50 years after this manuscript was produced, little more than 50 years later, Copernicus received a degree in church law from this university, the University of Ferrara. So he has a connection with this city. When Bianchini completed his tables, he prepared a special copy not just for the Duke, but for the Duke's own patron and lord, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. So let's zoom in on that and look at it more closely. This is Frederick, this is Bianchini, and this is the Duke of Ferrara, Borso d'Este. These are three courtiers in this scene. Frederick, to begin with him, became emperor in 1452. That's exactly when this manuscript was prepared. And he was the first member of the Habsburg family to assume that position. As emperor, his first step was to confirm the allegiance of his vassals. So this is a feudal relationship where the ruler of the land holds property from the emperor. That would be the Duke of Ferrara holds property from the emperor, in return for which he owes the emperor loyalty in the form of military and other kinds of obligations. So this is clearly a pre-capitalist arrangement. In this rather amazing scene, the court artist, known for his skill as a miniaturist, commemorates the fealty or the loyalty of the Duke of Ferrara, Borso d'Este. He also portrays Bianchini kneeling and presenting his tables to the emperor, but at the same time the Duke is presenting the astrologer together with his tables. So here, one thing we might notice is the hands of the Duke are on the shoulders of Bianchini, so he's literally presenting the person of the astrologer to the emperor. The emperor in turn is showing his herald to Bianchini and through him to the Duke. So there is you can think of this as being a reciprocal kind of relationship. And artistically speaking, the artist has visualized this as a kind of a circle here, and over here the three courtiers are bound together in a kind of circle. If you look at the legs, the feet of the main figures here, here's the right foot of the emperor. You can see it's overlapping the left foot of Bianchini, and back here you can see here's Bianchini's right foot, and it's intersecting the foot of one of the courtiers, and then here's the Duke's foot. You can see these are all they're all touching each other in a kind of interwoven pattern, kind of like the braid here on the head of the emperor. So this is a scene of political order, of authority and subordination, but also a scene of reciprocity. Reciprocal because at the center of the ceremony is the exchange of gifts. Bianchini's gift is a book of practical astronomy containing numbers of the sort that I've just been talking about. And in exchange, the emperor is presenting the Duke with his herald. So he's also, by the way, giving Bianchini a title of nobility. So Bianchini's getting a lot of this deal. Just to comment briefly here on the artistic similarity, this is a very well-known painting by Botticelli, the Three Graces from the larger picture of the of spring. And here you can see again this interweaving of the arms here of these figures. So it's a kind of interesting theme that we see in a rather unexpected place with Bianchini. Now, the tables contained within this beautiful manuscript were not published until 1495. So that's, 40 years later. And when they were published, they didn't have the illustrations. So it was kind of a dull-looking publication. But interestingly enough, the dedications to the Duke and to the Emperor were still in the book. So even though everybody in the picture was no longer around, the dedications were still published in 1495. So if we go back to this, this picture here, you can imagine then, or you can't really see this, but what is written in here is the first of two dedications, one to the Emperor, the first one to the Emperor, and then the second one on the following folio to the Duke. Now, Bianchini compares the Duke to the sun. Says the Duke's power and the Duke himself is the central power in his domain, just as the sun is the central force in the heavens. Well, it's central not because it's at rest, it's going around the earth. Right? The earth is at rest at the center. The sun orbits the earth, it produces effects through the mediation of the other planets. All this is in the dedication that I'm summarizing here. How does it do it? How are the effects produced? They're produced by the sun activating qualities in the planets, qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. The planetary positions listed in the tables are then the logically necessary conditions for determining various physical effects, enabling the prognosticator to calculate the timing and mixture of the various qualities. So you need the numbers, but you also need a physical theory to go with it, and that's basically what is underlying this. Well, let's turn now to a different scene, one for which we have no such brilliant illustration, I'm afraid. Some 40 years later, a Venetian printer named Johann Hamann, the German, issued what historians generally regard as the most important work of theoretical astronomy of the 15th century, called the Epitome of Ptolemy's Almagest. This is the title page. Not very exciting aesthetically. This work was the product of a collaboration. The work provided an improved abridgment in Latin of a work that was originally written in Greek in the 2nd century AD and later translated by Arabic scholars in the 9th century under the title Almagest. That's the word in Latin that we see here, Almagestum, Ptolemy's Almagest. The epitome of the Almagest, so that's an abridgment of the Almagest, was designed to make Ptolemy's great work of theoretical astronomy more usable, sometimes by developing implications of Ptolemy's planetary models that were only implicit. The work was begun at Vienna by a professor of mathematics at the city's university named Georg Feuerbach, and he was also the Emperor Frederick's astrologer, another bridge position. It was completed after his death in 1460 by his brilliant student, Johannes Regiomontanus. And that name appears here, Johannes de Monte Regio. Regiomontanus intended to publish the epitome at the print shop he had set up in his own house in Nuremberg. But like his teacher, he didn't live very long. He died in 1476 at the age of 40. And the manuscripts remained somewhere, but unpublished. When the book was finally published, 20 years later, it bore the date August 31st, 1496. You'll see in a moment why I'm concentrating on these dates, but they're important. But there's an additional surprising feature of this book that until now has attracted almost no scholarly notice. A very few surviving copies include a printed letter inserted at the front of the book, clearly meant to be published together with the main text. This letter is separately dated August 15th, so that's 2 weeks before, also at Venice. The book itself is found in many rare book collections, but most copies simply don't have the letter. So here's an example of a copy of this book in Uppsala in Sweden. I show you this because this is where the remaining collection of Copernicus's books is now located. Unfortunately, this copy of Regiomontanus lacks the letter at the front, and also, it's also not Copernicus's own copy. So it's not very useful for our purposes. There's another copy at the University of Oklahoma that I've acquired information about. It does have the letter inserted, but it's not an original. It's a facsimile. And it's basically a photocopy which a book dealer made from the original, and I think it came from the British Library. So, to date, I've been able to identify only 5 copies in the world that contain this mysterious letter. But thanks to an invention that was not available to Gutenberg, namely digitization, I've been able to do a lot of the work just by sitting at my keyboard and tracking down these copies. Okay, so let me turn to the letter now and say something about it. It's of considerable importance for 2 reasons. First, it sheds new light on the motives for the publication of this major work, the epitome of the Almagest. And secondly, because we know for certain that Copernicus used this work extensively as a young man in Bologna, and it was significant in establishing his own early understanding of Ptolemy's theories through Regiomontanus's presentation of them. In fact, one historian, Noel Swerdlow at Caltech, believes that Regiomontanus's epitome provided the crucial insight that opened the way for Copernicus to relocate the sun at the center of the finite universe. The letter's author was the virtually unknown Giovanni Battista Abbiosi. This is the letter, very unexciting visually. This is the first page. It continues on the back of this page, and then it continues on the front of a third page. So it's quite a long document. The heading of the letter represents Abbiosi with the title Professor of the Mathematical Arts and Doctor of Medicine from the Kingdom of Naples. The letter itself is a praise or encomium to astrology. And Abbiosi grandly characterizes astrology as the queen of the liberal arts. That's what he calls it. It's a discipline, he says, that ought to be called natural theology. A theology derived from natural causes because all effects are the result of prior causes, and all causes must ultimately go back to a first cause, and the first cause is, of course, God. So astrology, in his view, is the major science. It's also a branch of mathematics in the sense that all disciplines are founded on 4 principles. For example, geometry is founded on 4 definitions: the point, the line, the surface, and the third dimension, depth. Physics is built from 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and so forth. Well, Abbiosi's assumption here is the Pythagorean Platonic idea that there's just one number, in this case the number 4, which is common to all disciplines. This argument sounds rather curious and unconvincing to modern ears, accustomed, at the very least, to accepting 0 as the basis of counting. But the Greeks lacked the concept of 0 and didn't regard 1 as a number. So they thought of counting as, in fact, an assembling or amassing of ones or units. The Greek word is monad, for unit. Consequently, to say that there was only one number underlying all disciplines was to say that there was a oneness to the number 4. Something like this kind of thinking may, in fact, underlie the Christian notion of the Trinity, where God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are both one and many. But I must be careful not to commit the heresy of trying to rationalize a mystery. Abiossi informs the reader that he has insufficient space to defend astrology in the usual sense of astral prognostication. But he refers readers to a recent book published two years earlier in 1494, where he predicted calamitous events for the years 1503, 1524, and 1702. This is the, let me jump past this to the title page here. There you see his title. This is the work, the 1494 work. You can see here in the illustration, here's a figure sitting on a throne labeled Astrologia, astrology, holding two instruments, an armillary sphere and an astrolabe. And this is the figure of Ptolemy, and this is Urania, the goddess of astronomy. But notice that the banners here, let's look a little more closely. Notice that those banners are not, there's nothing written in them, right? Well, it's interesting that the frontispiece that you're looking at now has been borrowed, or perhaps pirated, from a slightly earlier Venetian publication. So you can see this is exactly the same, but it's 4 years earlier. It's a different book entirely, same guy, same instruments, but now he's called Astronomia, astronomy, and this time the banners are full. This is Ptolemy, and this is Urania. Here you have the sun and the moon and the stars. This sort of piracy of illustrations became very common among early printers. Remember, there are no copyright regulations of any sort, so it's an unregulated environment. Now, going back here to the 1494 work, Abiossi has dedicated his book to the Spanish ruler Alfonso II of Aragon, who was the King of Naples. But he was only the King of Naples for 1 year, from 1494 to 1495. And you know enough already from what I've told you to know that in those years, that's when the invasion was taking place by the French. So as the armies of Charles VIII approached Naples, Alfonso abdicated the throne. Abdicated in early 1495. He was only on the throne for 1 year. And then the French poured into Naples, and what they found amazed them, because the palace was magnificent. It had these Moorish gardens, there were baths, there were special hydraulic waterworks with surprise jets of water. All this was very fascinating to Charles VIII, and he left Naples with all sorts of goodies from the Neapolitan court, works of art, ideas for his own gardens. Now, although Abiossi had sent an advance copy of his prognostication to the king, it had somehow failed to predict that Alfonso would no longer be king when the prognostication arrived. So this is the problem. If you're an astrological prognosticator and you get it wrong, or you don't say anything about it, what happens to your reputation? Well, 2 years later, Abiossi is composing the letter that we've been looking at here to Regiomontanus's epitome. And this time, he's more careful. He doesn't dedicate it to the king. And that was a good thing, because the next guy who took the throne also lasted only a year. And so, again, put yourself in the position of an astrological prognosticator. Hey, put yourself in the position of any prognosticator, even today. It's a sort of tricky pursuit. What's abundantly clear from Abiossi's letter is that he believed that the publication of Regiomontanus's work would enhance the epistemic reputation of astrology and its practitioners. Scholars, he said, should acquire the books of those who best understand the heavens. So this is the reason, he says in the letter, that he's gone to so much trouble to publish this, highly technical treatise. He's copied it with his own hands. He says this in the letter. He's corrected the errors of other copyists. He's fixed the positions of misplaced figures, and working directly with the printers, he names them. He has restored the text. So now the fully corrected text with its geometrical demonstrations is available in clear Latin, and Abiossi says very proudly, it surpasses Ptolemy. And after Ptolemy, he goes on, Regiomontanus should be regarded as the king of mathematics. So he writes in conclusion, let us render thanks to these remarkable Germans who have advanced and lifted up astrology. He ends by listing several other manuscripts by Regiomontanus that he intends to publish, but none of them ever appeared from his efforts. Okay, so what we want to bear in mind here is that the copies of the book that contain this letter have a very clear and explicit astrological justification. What we don't know is whether Copernicus had such a copy. But this is exactly the moment when Copernicus would have known this book. Well, now let me just say one more thing about Abiossi and his vision of the relationship between astronomy and astrology that can be found in the artwork in the frontispiece. The printer and the engraver of Regiomontanus's epitome, with whom Abiossi worked directly, seems to have adapted the arrangement that we saw in Abiossi's astrological forecast of 1494 to this engraving. The scene is still allegorical. In this case, an imaginary encounter between an ancient authority, and this is Ptolemy. You can see him sitting here looking down at a book, and a modern authority here who, if you can see the hand here, it's being raised in a kind of didactic pose, you know, kind of do this, do that kind of gesture. And so that nobody could miss the point, he has written the names Ptolemy and Regiomontanus underneath each of these two characters. In the background, there's a kind of a natural scene, and in the middle, dominating everything, is this by now familiar armillary sphere with the zodiac. What's not so clear from the image, and would be difficult to pick out, is that there's a motto inscribed here going around the border. And this is what I want to say something about now. The words in Latin will not mean anything to you, but so I'm going to give you the English translation. The translation is, the soul dwelled upon its deeper thoughts under the image of the world. The soul dwelled upon its deeper thoughts under the image of the world. What can this possibly mean? Well, a French historian by the name of Isabelle Pontin has carefully traced the genealogy of this saying and its associated representations on other frontispieces, and she suggests that the meaning is that the human soul derives intellectual and spiritual inspiration from the heavenly spheres. And she ends her analysis with a question, and I'm going to quote, "One wonders if it's necessary to go so far as to give the imago mundi, the image of the world, the sense of an astrological or magical image." Well, I suggest that Abiossi's letter and his close involvement in the printing of Regiomontanus's text strongly implies that this was precisely the publisher's intent. But the absence of Abiossi's letter from so many surviving copies has encouraged historians to read Regiomontanus's work as if it lacked any astrological motivation. So that's essentially how this book has been treated. It's been treated as a work of, a great work of astronomy, the greatest work of its time, the work that Copernicus read. All the astrological meanings and connotations have simply been stripped out. So that's basically what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to put them back in here to sort of see what kind of picture we're left with. Well, here we have then an astrological physician from Naples, working directly in the Venetian printing business, actively collaborating with German printers to put out a major work of theoretical astronomy, which was critical in Copernicus's early intellectual formation. In treating astrology as the motivating discipline for this project, Abiossi was hardly unusual. Regiomontanus himself had introduced a new method for dividing up the zodiac, and he also announced his intention to publish Ptolemy's astrological treatise, the Tetrabiblos. So there's no doubt that Regiomontanus himself had all sorts of interests in astrology, including publishing old astrological texts. But he didn't live long enough to do so. But we know that many of the Italian universities of this period required the professors of mathematics to issue astrological forecasts each year. And here's an example of such a figure, Domenico Maria Novara. You have his dates and his title. This is essentially the same sort of position that Abiossi seems to have held in Naples. We know that Novara issued astrological forecasts every year between 1484 and 1504. When Copernicus arrived in Bologna in the fall of 1496 to begin his study of law, he had to do what most students did when they arrived in a new university. They had to find a place to live. And where did he live? He lived with Novara in his house. Very common sort of arrangement, by the way, in which impoverished students and faculty who were not paid enough, an unusual phenomenon, benefited from one another. Well, we actually know the location of the house. Here's a map of Bologna, kind of close up. You can see the house is located at the time kind of on the outskirts, because here are the fields, but it's on this main drag that goes into the center, the piazza here, the main church, the Senate, governed by 16 powerful families, and also one of the residences of the prince. So Novara really was, a major figure in the city at this time. We know from Rheticus's later report that Copernicus, while he was studying law, assisted Novara in some way with his observations. Here's the evidence. Copernicus arrived about 1 month after the appearance of Regiomontanus's book, and about 2 months or so after a Bologna publisher issued another book, which was a massive attack on the entire foundations of astrology. This attack was authored by a Florentine philosopher whose name might be well known to some of you, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, shown here. Happy to have this nice illustration of Pico. Very sort of common 60s hairstyle. Let's say the 1460s. Well, unlike Abiossi's generic defense of astrology in mid-August of this very same year, 1496, Pico's attack on astrology was specific, harsh, and unrelenting. He stressed not only the astrologers' inaccuracies, but also their frequent disagreements and their unwarranted belief that the zodiac was real. Pico said, "This zodiac is just a construction of the human imagination." Let's remember that the zodiac, which we've now seen in several different representations, was not just a map for locating the planets' positions, but it was believed that the signs themselves could send down influences to the Earth. And as if that were not enough, Pico went beyond astrology to include its astronomical foundations. He claimed that astrologers disagreed about the order of the planets. He also charged that their assignment of physical qualities associated with each planet was arbitrary. Until Pico's critique, astrologers like Abiossi had no problem with these associations whatsoever. But after Pico, all of this became problematic. So let me just explain briefly what the problem was. Let's look here for a moment at the Aristotelian elements. These are not the elements of Lavoisier in the 18th century. They're not the ones you learned in high school. So you have earth, air, fire, and water. Some of you will be well familiar with these. And associated with each element were two sensory qualities. So here we see, let's take fire as an example. Fire is warm and dry. Earth, right next to it, is dry and cold. Water is cool and moist, and so forth. So that's the scheme. It's a simple one. Now, quite early in his astrological treatise, the Tetrabiblos, Ptolemy makes a central move. He ties these sensory qualities associated with the Aristotelian elements directly to the order of the planets. This, by the way, is the Earth. Okay, so Ptolemy says the Earth sends out moist exhalations. Well, that may be true in Tampa, but at any rate, that's what he says. Now, once you've built these qualities into the planets, as Ptolemy does very early in his book, the planets carry these qualities around with them. So as they rise and set, as they move around the zodiac, form different angular combinations with one another and with different signs, they're mixing together. You can see easily enough how these qualities, hot, cold, moist, and dry, lent themselves easily to a language of the weather. But a physician could also use these categories for diagnosing the state of the body. Fevers, sweats, cold palms, and so forth. And of course, the elements also enable a language of personal temperaments. The word temperament comes from astrology. So we might speak of, or they might speak of, a sunny or drippy personality, a dry wit, a warm hello, a jovial or cold disposition, and so forth. Furthermore, all these qualities were capable of being made more or less intense as the planets lined up in different angular arrangements. But the point I want to emphasize here is that the association of these qualities with planetary order, this is established early on in Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, and it precedes all the subsequent motions, combinations, mixtures, and so forth. So effectively, you might think of it this way: the astronomical part of the science of the stars was a kind of computer for mixing together the qualities, combining, recombining, intensifying, relaxing them to produce specific effects. But Pico pointed out an inconsistency between Ptolemy's handling of the order of Mercury and Venus in the Almagest. So here, saying, some people say Venus is here and other people say it's here. Some people say Venus and Mercury are on this side of the sun. Some people say Venus is here and Mercury is here. Ptolemy reports disagreement. But in the Tetrabiblos, he doesn't report any disagreement. These qualities are cemented right into this order. They're fixed. So when we turn to Regiomontanus's epitome of the Almagest, all he does is echo Ptolemy. He says, yeah, some people think, Venus is above the sun, and some people say it's below, and some people say Mercury is closer to the Earth and some further away. Regiomontanus calls it a controversy. Now, what Pico says is, here's still just another example where the astronomers and the astrologers don't agree with each other. It's another example of the fallibility of the whole subject. So that's how Copernicus would have encountered the question when he read Regiomontanus, and although he doesn't mention Pico by name in his masterwork, we know for certain that he had read Pico's book, and we know for certain he had read this chapter that I've just been describing to you. So, to underline this point, Pico is not just expressing individual concerned with astrology. He's attacking astrology and its practitioners by way of attacking the entire web of social and political arrangements of which they were a part, including the rulers who had their own astrologers and the universities which supported the teaching of the science of the stars and made the issuance of annual astrological prognostications an obligation of the resident astronomer-astrologers. In fact, the year after Pico's book appeared, the Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola, who had become leader of Florence when the French armies kicked out the Medici, incorporated some of Pico's main arguments into a popular Italian work that denounced astrologers as greedy and corrupt. He also rejected the existence of the zodiac as nothing but a human construction, as you can see in this passage here that I'm not going to read, but put up here for you to consult. A year later, in 1498, Savonarola was deposed. First, he was excommunicated by the Pope as a rebellious preacher. Then he was captured. His body was hung and burnt in the main piazza of Florence. A few years later, not many, the Medici returned to power in Florence, and they brought back their astrologers, and someone named Niccolo Machiavelli used the episode in a book about how princes should rule, although nowhere mentioning astrology. Well, less well known today than Machiavelli is the astrological physician Lucio Bellanti. In the same year as Savonarola's overthrow, Bellanti published A Defense of Astrology, 1498, and a detailed answer to Pico and Savonarola. Bellanti directed much of his reply to Pico's criticisms of astrology, but he had little specific to say about astronomy. To answer Pico's astronomical objections would involve something more than just citing counter-authorities. Bellanti's later fame rested more securely on his spurious claim that an astrologer had forecast Pico's death in 1494. Well, I know I've been mentioning quite a few things here. I want to summarize some of these in this chronology that you may like to look at as I continue with this portion of my talk. Between 1496 and 1500, so this 4-year period, Copernicus was living with Navarra, and it's difficult to imagine that he could have been unaware of the dramatic political events going on in Florence. However, the first we know about Copernicus's theory is from a manuscript that he composed about 7 or 8 years after he left Italy to go back to Poland. That's in 1510. And historians have analyzed this manuscript. It doesn't have any political content. It's a very bare bones kind of argument. But it does contain the essentials of his new theory. Copernicus continued to work on the mature statement of his theory, but we don't know really much about this interim period before his book came out. The next we hear about Copernicus's theory is a well-known episode that occurred in 1533. And that's the last episode I'm going to deal with in this paper, but I think it's very important. We know that a presentation was made in 1533. So now we're 23 years after Copernicus has set down his basic ideas. 1533, a high-ranking official in Rome at the Pope's court. His name was Johann Albrecht Wittmannstätter. I'll put his name up in a moment. He had somehow learned the details of Copernicus's theory. He probably ran into somebody in Rome who knew Copernicus and heard. We don't know how he learned about it, but we know for sure he knew about it because Wittmannstätter made some kind of a presentation in the form of a lecture about Copernicus's theory in the Vatican Gardens, which are really nice, good place for a lecture. And who was in the audience? Well, the Pope, Clement VII, 2 cardinals, a bishop, and the Pope's personal physician. So here's the chronology I've been discussing here, and I'm adding a couple of details to fill this in for your information. To reward Widmanstätter for his efforts, the Pope gave him the gift of a Greek manuscript, on which Widmanstätter then wrote down, you know, here's what I did, here's when I did it, and here's who was present. That's how we know about this event. But before any further actions could occur, the Pope died, and Widmanstätter then quickly entered the service of a powerful cardinal in Rome. His name was Nicholas Schoenberg. Widmanstätter must have told Schoenberg about Copernicus's theory soon thereafter, because the cardinal immediately wrote a letter directly to Copernicus in Poland, saying, you know, I've just heard about your ideas, this idea of the Earth moving around the sun, and I would be willing to send an amanuensis, that is to say a copyist, not a photocopier, but a person copy, up to Poland to copy the entire book. So even though we have printing, the book hasn't been printed yet. So that's the best you could do. What did Copernicus do? He got the letter. He didn't reply. He held on to it. But later, he published it. In fact, right after the first page of his book, you have this letter from Cardinal Schoenberg saying, I would love to see a copy of your theory. Could you please send it to me? I'll send you an amanuensis. That's right in Copernicus's book. So Copernicus used the letter to signal to his readers that he had the approval of Rome. The whole episode I've just described to you is, by the way, very well known. And you can find, I mean, all you have to do is go into Google and you'll find it. Nothing new has been said about this that I can find in the last 100 years. But no one has asked the question why a pope, a cardinal, and a learned Orientalist scholar like Widmanstätter would have had such great interest in an astronomical theory that promised to overthrow the foundations of astronomy as taught in all the universities of Europe. So why did this event even take place? That's the question I'm asking. Once again, it turns out there are important clues. Here's a copy of Lucio Belanti's book. This is the title page. And this book is in Munich in the Staatsbibliothek. And lo and behold, we have a signature of the owner here. And who is it? Well, it's Widmanstadius. That's his Latin spelling of his name. It's his copy. The book is 1498. He hadn't been born yet, so he must have acquired it sometime after. I don't know exactly when. He hasn't put any notes in the book, for which I am not happy, but he didn't. But it was in his library. And it tells us, at the very least, that Widmanstätter was aware of the controversy between Belanti and Pico, going back to the 1490s, about the status of astrology. Well, it turns out there's another book with Widmanstätter's signature. This book is called Homocentrica. And who wrote it? Fracastoro. Remember Fracastoro? He's the guy who named the French disease syphilis. So he's a physician, but he's also an astronomer. And by the way, both topics are in this book. Very peculiar. I'm not going to go into detail about the Homocentrica. It's well known to historians of astronomy. The basic idea that Fracastoro had was to reject Ptolemy's theory of off-center circles and spheres and to make everything concentric. In other words, the Earth is the center of all motions, and each sphere has its own center on the Earth. It's not a very good theory. It doesn't predict as well as Ptolemy's theories. But that was his idea. Interesting. The work is dedicated to Pope Paul III. Turns out, this was Widmanstätter's new patron. Not only that, Paul III is the same pope to whom Copernicus dedicated his book. So the the noose is beginning to tighten here on these relationships. But there's more. Fracastoro in 1530, before this book came out, 1538 here, Fracastoro theorized that syphilis was spread by the movement of internal bodily humors rather than by astral influences. That's interesting. Syphilis spread by what he called seeds of contagion. Fracastoro attacked the idea that was widely held by physicians, followers of the Roman physician Galen, that the crisis point of a disease was correlated with phases of the moon. So on this matter, Fracastoro was following exactly the critique of Pico della Mirandola in 1496. Pico and Fracastoro both rejected Galen's theory that every disease has a period of critical days affected by phases of the moon. And Fracastoro rejects this theory as, I quote, nothing but pure chance and love of astrology. So it's easy to see why the debate about the stars causing disease and whether the course of disease is predictable from the heavens was a topic of widespread concern among physicians in the 16th century. It certainly must have been a source of great interest to Copernicus as a medical student in Padua in 1501, but also to Matthias Curtius, who was the Pope's physician, present in the Vatican Gardens when Wittmannstetter gave his lecture. So Curtius, the Pope's physician, was not only a traditional Galenist, but also an opponent of Pico's views on astrology. And Curtius's views would have positioned him against Fracastoro on the cause of syphilis, and this is probably why there was so much interest in 1533 in this new theory, that maybe Copernicus had come up with a new theory that would somehow allow the occurrence of syphilis to be predicted. Perhaps the papal audience believed that Copernicus's new principle of planetary order, following the Pythagoreans and rejecting Pico, would offer a more secure basis for defending the astrological part of the science of the stars. Whatever reasons Copernicus had for delaying the publication of his book, his reservations were decisively overcome with the arrival of Rheticus in 1539 from Wittenberg. Very quickly, Rheticus won the trust of the older man. He was allowed to read the manuscript. He was further permitted to write up a short description of it. Here we see a copy of Rheticus's book, which I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, the Narratio Prima. So, with Copernicus's evident approval, this first account appeared very rapidly, 1540, then again in 1541. And in that work, Rheticus wrote, "If my teacher's account of the celestial phenomena had existed a little before our time, Pico would have had no opportunity of impugning not merely astrology, but also astronomy." Now, this important passage strengthens my conclusion that Copernicus and Rheticus had not merely discussed astrology, as Rosen and Hartner were arguing about in 1973 in that Polish limo, but that Rheticus regarded Copernicus's hypothesis as providing a robust answer to Pico's objections to the astronomical foundations of astrology. Some 40 years after Rosen and Hartner emerged from their heated discussion in that Polish limo, the question they were debating might better be posed: where did Copernicus stand in the Piconian controversies? To my mind, that's a better question to ask. So let me conclude then briefly. Astrological concerns clearly drove the production of all the astronomical works I've considered today. At stake were the astrological interests of major rulers, the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Naples, two popes, Clement VII and Paul III, a cardinal, Nicholas Schoenberg, but also the interests of printers and court advisors, and the epistemological credibility of astrologers, and astrological physicians. Copernicus's De Revolutionibus has been seen rightly as a foundational text in the history of the natural sciences, the beginning of a major long-term scientific change. But of course, Copernicus did not know that his work would prepare the way for Galileo and Newton. Surprising point. Those later developments might be thought of as unanticipated consequences associated with his moving the stationary Pythagorean central fire into the setting of a reformed Ptolemaic astronomy. It appears that Copernicus returned to the ancient Pythagorean teaching, which he found already in Aristotle, seeking a solution to the chronic uncertainties of political and medical prognostication that he shared with his contemporaries. Thank you.